It was one of those small sounds that feel bigger than they are, a clean, mechanical rasp that split the summer quiet and left the rest of the street holding its breath. The overhead light hummed as it slid up, and I stayed kneeling over the Camaro's stubborn carburetor, grease under my nails, wrench warm from the fight. The punching bag in the corner still rocked from my last round, my knuckles throbbed in a way that had nothing to do with muscle. I listened for Marta's heels on the porch, the shuffling of keys, the familiar domestic signs that meant the ordinary patterns of our life were still intact. The house answered with the steady hum of the refrigerator, the fridge light that always stayed on too long, the distant television in the living room that must have been muted. Her laptop sat on the workbench where she'd left it, my wife, who treated her electronics like pets, tidy and charged and ready. It should have been unremarkable. It wasn't. When I wiped a palm on my jeans and nudged the keyboard with an oily fingertip, the screen woke with a glow that made the grease look like a smear of something less innocent. A message window was open. At first I thought it was a text she'd left herself, a reminder, one of those business notes. Then the words trembled into focus, and everything in the garage narrowed. Can't wait to feel you inside me again tonight at the mansion. Wear nothing but that smile I love so much, Jake. The wrench slipped from my hand and clattered against the concrete. The sound felt obscene, a foreign noise in the room that used to hold only small, manageable disasters, loose bolts, leaky faucets, a dead battery. My mouth went dry with the sudden sterility of the world. For a long beat I didn't think at all. I just stared, as if the screen might rearrange itself into something less damning. It didn't. The window was full of messages, times, hotel names, photos of a hand on a bedsheet, a blurred corner of a hotel logo. There were schedules, lunches, late nights, excuses about client deadlines that had started to smell of rehearsed lines. So that's what it was. Not some midlife whim, not stress from the promotion she worked so hard for, not late nights at the agency. It was something else. Someone else. My name is David Mitchell, 46. Calloused hands from a life that has always asked things of me and rarely given them back. Infantry boots for 20 years and then a safer uniform moving pallets and schedules for a logistics company. A mortgage behind by a month, a truck that rattled more than it drove some days, 2 kids I would have given the world to in a heartbeat. Ross, 17, quick with a sarcastic grin and a devastatingly honest way of seeing people. Amelia, 15, still convinced monsters lived under the bed and still liked to have me check. Marta, with the easy laugh and sharp mind. The woman I married because she could make me laugh at myself even when I was trying not to. 23 years of that were sitting on a screen between 2 people who had apparently been rehearsing how to erase me. For a moment, I thought I should react the way men on television do demand explanations, shout, smash things. I reached for my phone to call Ross, to tell him to stay at school, to call my boss, and invent a reason for an absence. Instead, I did something quieter, sharper. I took screenshots. The army taught me a lot that civilians called cold. Patience was one of them. Gather the facts. Don't let emotion erode the mission. I saved the messages, backed them up to an email draft, even took pictures of timestamps and photo metadata. Information was power. Information could be used. Marta's silence in the house felt like a presence. Her perfume spent, expensive, still lingered by the door where she dropped her bag. I traced the scent without meaning to and thought about every small kindness over the years. The way she'd worn my boots before I put them on. The Christmas, she made me a ridiculous sweater with my initials stitched crookedly across the chest. The way she sat on the edge of my bed the night I came home from Afghanistan and didn't sleep for 2 days. Had it all been a setup? Had I misread every look, every laugh? My chest felt hollow, an echo chamber where every memory I had of her came back edited, suspicious. She came home around midnight, quietly enough that her shoes barely whispered against the hardwood. She looked wrong. Not disheveled, not glamorous, just hungover the way some lies age a person overnight. Her makeup was gone. Her smile was a practiced thing. "You're still up," she said, voice small in our kitchen, as if we were 2 strangers reciting lines. "Did you learn anything interesting at your meeting?" I asked. I kept my voice level on purpose, a deliberate flatness to hide the storm, just the usual client drama. Her eyes slid away. She moved with a haste that said maybe for someone else this would be ordinary. For me, the words collapsed. I drank my bourbon slowly, tasting heat and memory and something else that wasn't warmth. You don't get that training waiting with a wound in your chest unless the wound is fresh. The next morning, she left early. A peck on the cheek that used to mean see you later felt like a confession now. I called in sick to the job for the first time in 3 years. One of the invisible things the army gave me. You never let your personal life bleed into a mission without a plan. I had to know before I acted. Kill shots in anger were bad. Kill shots in the dark of unpreparedness were worse. I'm patient. I can wait. I watched the mansion where Jake Morrison lived that afternoon. From the road, it looked like arrogance turned into architecture. Walls of glass reflecting a lake like a polished silver platter. Cranes of steel that served no functional purpose beyond saying I'm better than you. A Tesla sat in the circular driveway like a black jewel. Cameras on the eaves peered like unblinking eyes. The property could have been art on a postcard if art were permitted to mock other people. I learned his name, Jake Morrison, Senior Creative Director. 38, divorced, no kids. I found him online in the way you find things now. Photographs staged for effect, a social media presence, sun-bronzed and curated, an empire of selfies that said, look at me, look at me. His divorce had been noisy enough to leave traces, a few public jabs in the comments, a woman who'd chosen a different life. There were patterns you could read in those fractures. At the gym, Eddie wrapped my hands and watched me work the heavy bag like a man evaluating a fighter he didn't know. You hitting angry, he said. The way men say things that sound like questions but are really invitations. I didn't argue. I let the gloves come down like small dull planets against canvas. Let my fists talk in a language I trusted for most of my life. Boxing is tidy vengeance. Measure, strike, recover. The bag took the conversation without complaining. I started to dig. Not the hero in the movies sort of digging, but the methodical sort, the kind that doesn't make a lot of noise. Jake's patterns emerged like a map when you held the map to the light. Thursday night gym, weekend parties out of town, a lakefront house with the lights turned off by 9, like he believed the dark could hide the obvious. I sent a friend request to a woman who'd been married to him, an ex-wife who carried a look that belonged to someone who'd been in the ring and come out hand-broken but alive. Christina agreed to meet for coffee, and within 30 minutes and 2 nervous lattes, told me things that didn't come with kindness. Jake was a hunter, she said, the sort who picked targets with professional optimism. He liked to make women feel chosen and then leave them like a spent match. She's not the first, Christina said. Her hands trembled slightly on the rim of her cup. He knows how to sell himself. He knows how to make the other man look small. I thought of Ross and Amelia, what it would do to them to watch their parents unspool in public. Already, the rumor mill had teeth. The company was a place where privacy went to die. An affair with someone like Jake wasn't a private wound, it was a parade. Christina handed me a notebook of sorts, names, dates, a pattern of hotels, gym nights, certain phrases he used to seduce women into thinking they were brave and unique. She wasn't bitter. I don't think men like Jake leave bitterness behind in the way other men do, but she had something else, a kind of exhausted clarity. If you're thinking of doing anything, be smarter than him, she told me. Don't be stupid. I wasn't. I knew how to be patient. I knew how to plan. That night, I did something a man like me should have been able to resist, and that men like me sometimes can't. I drove out to the property. I parked a distance away, let the dark be an ally. My truck's engine died with a click that sounded too loud. I moved through underbrush the way I used to move across sand and scrub in a desert in the past life they tell you gets left behind. Your body remembers. My breathing found its old rhythm. I carried a dead fish in a paper bag, the meat cold and steaming in the summer air. It was a stupid thing, childish, and perfectly suited to the message I wanted to send. I had a can of spray paint in the truck and a tactical knife folded in my pocket, tools that were more for show than for harm. I slashed tires quietly, a mega hiss after a mega hiss, the sound of inflated arrogance letting out air. The smell of fish in the cabin later would be a humiliation he couldn't buy back with money. I wrote a note and left it on the windshield. This smells better than your character. Home wrecker. I spray painted across the hood hunks of red letters that felt petty and also satisfying in that very small circle of justice I was trying to draw. Somewhere a camera turned. Somewhere footage of my profile probably floated into a cloud. But I pressed my baseball cap lower, exhaled slow, and let the dark carry me away. All the while, Marta's phone buzzed with calls, texts, can't sleep, be home soon, insomnia, the same language she'd used so casually for months to explain away night after night at the office. She called at strange hours. She laughed at the strange jokes. She bought new lingerie she didn't wear for me. I thought about my life. All the small betrayals that add up, the quiet omissions, the late credits, the unexplained receipts. You don't notice the thread until someone pulls it and the sweater comes apart in your hands. In the days that followed, the house became a battlefield of small tensions. We ate meals that tasted like admitting truths and then clapped the lid back on them. Marta's eyes would slide to my face and then away, and I would study her hands, trying to read a language she thought she'd hidden. When she called Jake, she always hummed like a woman she imagined didn't mind telling small white lies. When Ross asked if we were okay, I told him that some things were being worked through and that everyone would be fine. I wanted to believe the words as much as I wanted him to believe them. Parents ought to be reservoirs of certainty that the children can drink from. I felt my reservoir run low. Then the graffiti blew up online. Photos of a black Tesla vandalized, a furious man raving about psychotic criminals, hashtags and speculation. The police called. Detective Sarah Chen said my name over the phone like a thing she had to check off a list. She was not unkind. "Mr. Mitchell, do you have any connection to Mr. Morrison?" "No," I said. It was the truth as it mattered in that moment. My wife and he work together. I don't know him. But my hands were heavy with other truths, and the evidence on my phone became a second life. She warned me to keep a distance. It was the sort of warning people give when they want to be polite about the fact that they think trouble will follow. It shouldn't have been satisfying, the chaos I'd started, but there was a grim comfort in the humiliation reflected back through his public complaints. The arrogance of his online rants declared him the hurt party, and the world, hungry for drama, lapped it up. Marta watched the feeds with a hand over her mouth sometimes, looking smaller on the couch at night. Whether it was guilt or fear, I couldn't tell. Whatever it was, it softened the edges of her self-possession. Some nights I wanted to explode, strip everything back to the bone in the raw way that felt like clarity. Other nights I lay awake letting the slow burn of strategic patience do what it had done when the mission mattered most. In the army, you learn that the high ground isn't always the hill you stand on, but the timing of your strike. I practiced timing. I learned the rhythm of Jake's public life and Marta's private excuses. I gathered the data until I had enough to make actions make sense. At home, the family photos looked like set pieces in someone else's life. Ross with a debate trophy, Amelia with green face paint from last year's school play, Martia and me at Niagara Falls, frozen in mid-smile. They were memories, sure enough, good ones to make dissolving them feel like treason, yet the images had a new weight. Context matters. When you know that a smile was practiced for someone else, the photograph becomes evidence. I am no saint. I'm a man with a temper and the patience of a trained soldier, which is not always a better temper. I chose to move like both. There was a cold something in me that had nothing to do with righteousness. It had to do with a clarity born of violation. The night the laptop revealed the first message, a small, human thing in me died, and another thing, something more like a plan, was born. The love that had been was slotted now beside a new thing, a need to reclaim. If he had expected me to fold, he was wrong. If she had expected me to plead, she was wrong. If anyone thought I wouldn't act, they were wrong. I rearranged my life around the quiet, like someone moving furniture to hide the evidence of infestation. I filed screenshots, wrote notes, memorized times. When Ross asked why I was home those days, I said I had to catch up on paperwork. "Work from home?" Ross guessed. "Something like that," I answered, and felt no need to lie beyond what the moment required. A father protects his children first, even from the truth. On the third day, Marta came home with a new excuse, a promotion dinner, a client who insisted on late nights. Her voice was the voice of someone who'd practiced the story. She nodded when I mentioned the vandalism on the news, as if she hadn't been the subject of those messages, as if everything could be compartmentalized neatly. But people build habits we can read. She was avoiding certain corners, a little more careful with her phone. Those small evasions are always the first cracks. That night I slept in the living room. It felt theatrical and necessary at once, some demonstration of her to make an honest person accountable. Ross found his socks in a drawer and cursed softly, thinking that his father was losing his mind. Amelia texted silly emojis and asked if I wanted pancakes in the morning. There were pieces of normal life that kept folding into the frame like the stubborn return of the tide. You could not throw a match into this and expect the world to go blazing. Life has a way of reasserting itself around any outrage. Homework still needed checking. Engines needed tuning. The ordinary kept insisting on its presence. Yet, in the quiet of the living room, with the television reruns throwing light across the carpet and the house breathing around me, I allowed myself a private satisfaction. The plan had begun. The first strike had been small, stupid, and therefore perfectly scaled to the lesson I wanted to teach. The real work would come later: motions at the bank, conversations with people who had names and leverage, the slow, methodical unspooling of an affair into pieces that the light could reach. For tonight, the knowledge that she could no longer pretend with impunity would have to do. Outside, a siren wailed somewhere in the distance and then faded. Inside, the house settled into a hush that felt less like peace and more like a waiting room. I lay on the couch and watched the ceiling like a man marking off the minutes until something came to pass. In the radio static and the soft thump of the walls as the house cooled, I heard a new sound. Not the sound of what had been breaking, but the sound of something being built from that break. A life reorganized, a plan forming. When morning came, Marta kissed the kids goodbye with the practiced tenderness of someone who believed in the illusion enough to help maintain it. I watched the car disappear down the street, watched the world go on in its small, habitual ways that make pain manageable. Then I stood in the kitchen with a cup of coffee that tasted like cardboard and began to map the next stages of this war. This is not the part where everything goes nuclear. This is the part where patience and patience alone would decide the outcome. The army had taught me how to wait without surrender, how to keep the heart in check and the hand steady. I poured another cup and began to write the list: evidence, witnesses, finances, timing. The things you need to take when you're reclaiming a life are rarely romantic. They are spreadsheets and bank statements and the kind of truth that won't be shouted away. And as I wrote, the kitchen clock ticked on, indifferent and accurate, slicing the hours into small units I could afford to spend. I wasn't sure whether I would find forgiveness on the other side of this. I wasn't sure I wanted it. There was only one thing I was sure of. I did not intend to be the man who walked away without making the people who had lied know the cost. The mission had a new objective: expose, reclaim, and protect. The plan would be surgical. The stakes were a marriage, 2 kids, a life built on the trust of small daily agreements. For now, the first chapter had closed with the discovery and the first flicks of fire. There would be more. There would be reckoning. The quiet before the storm had a smell to it like fish and gasoline and the sharp tang of betrayal, and I breathed it in like a soldier learning a new terrain. The day after the party, the house felt like a courtroom waiting for the gavel. The kids moved through their routines with that particular choreography teenagers do when they sense an unspoken verdict. Quick, efficient, eyes averted, questions rehearsed and then swallowed. Ross came downstairs in a hoodie with the weight of a semester and the arrogance of 17 years. Amelia floated in with headphones and an apple, sprite and bright and unaware that the world had shifted under her feet. They asked the usual things: homework, who was picking them up, what was for dinner, and I answered as if the household had not been hollowed out by an eminently ordinary kind of treachery. Parents are custodians of normalcy even when their hands shake. But normalcy is a thin veneer when you're holding a dossier of betrayal in your phone. For days I ran combinations in my head like punches on a speed bag. There were options, some loud and destructive and quick, others surgical and slow. For a man trained to think in phases and contingencies, the choice was obvious: win the strategic fight, not the emotional one. The army had taught me to value the long view. In war, a lost battle that preserves your force can win you the campaign. In life, the same calculus applied, only the currency was reputation, custody, money, the future of children who had trusted a lie. Christina was the first meaningful ally. We met again in that coffee shop downtown with the loop of old paperbacks and the brewer who seemed to take pleasure in making single origin beans taste like ceremony. She had the look of someone who'd moved through grief into a kind of coolness that was not resignation but collection. She produced a folder that looked like something out of a detective novel, printouts, screenshots, a ledger with dates, and slid it across the table. "He keeps a rhythm," she said. "Thursday nights, sometimes Sundays. He likes the thrill of the chase. He likes to believe the secret makes him a kind of god." Her hands were steady. "He's sloppy with money and sloppy with passwords. After the divorce, I kept access to some of his old accounts, stupid on my part, but he never bothered to lock everything down. He's arrogant that way. Arrogance is brittle. I had seen it in Kandahar and on bases back home, men who wear bravado like armor until the world chinks at the seams. With Christina's information, the seams were starting to fray. There were hotel names, a gym membership number, a list of vendors who handled his corporate events. There were screenshots of messages with the same particular cadence, diminutive pet names, invitations couched as curses. She pointed to a line of text that read, "You make me feel alive," and shrugged. He knows what to say. He preys on the quiet dissatisfaction people have with their lives, makes them feel dangerous. We talked logistics, what to expose, how public to go, what risk to the children was acceptable. Christina's face hardened when I mentioned Ross and Amelia. "You have to protect them," she said. "This isn't a movie. People get hurt." Her warning landed like a brace. I hadn't wanted the kids in collateral damage, not then or ever. But I also knew the way lies metastasize. If I took the fight quietly legal, patient Marta and Jake would have time to hide and spin. If I tore everything open too quickly, the fallout could destroy already fragile things. The plan we sketched between sips of coffee was clinical. First, gather proof that could stand in a courtroom and in public view. Emails, financial transfers, receipts, hotel bookings, anything that connected the dots. Second, make contact with people who could corroborate ex-wives, friends who'd left, anyone who had seen the same patterns. Third, create pressure points that didn't endanger the kids but made the affair unsustainable. Restrictions on access to joint accounts, an audit of recent withdrawals, notifications to the bank where suspicious transfers could be flagged. Fourth, seed doubt among Marta's co-workers subtly. People in offices are porous. Gossip moves faster than policy memos. See the right idea at the right moment, and the office itself becomes an ally. Afterwards, I drove home with a folder on the passenger seat like contraband. The city slid by in its late afternoon malaise strip malls and shuttered storefronts, manicured lawns with flags that flapped like small, patriotic flags to old ideals. I kept my hands at 10 and 2 on the wheel, not because the truck required it, but because some part of me still respected rituals that had nothing to do with the dashboard. At home, the kids asked for snacks and homework help. I kept my tone conversational, masking the calculations like a surgeon's steady hand covering the tremor beneath. Over the next week, I lived two lives in the same skin. In daylight, I was the father and the man who clocked in and logged inventory and resolved vendors' complaints with the sort of bland competence that keeps companies from collapsing. At night, I was a reconnaissance unit, combing through bank statements, learning the cadence of Marta's calls, cross-referencing names from Christina's ledger with Marta's credit card receipts. I visited the local library and, with the precision of an old pro, pulled public records and property filings that gave me more context about Jake's limited but flashy holdings. He rented space, he didn't own everywhere he pretended to. That detail bloomed into possibility. If he was investing someone else's money, Marta's money, perhaps there would be paper trails. Paper can be subpoenaed, paper can be public. When Marta came home late from work, the house vibrated with the smell of expensive coffee and the faint ghost of someone else's cologne. She moved around like a person who had rehearsed domesticity, dishes, a glance towards the children, a smile that didn't reach the eyes. Sometimes she touched my arm in a way that was meant to reassure and that only made the wound feel fresh. "How was your day?" She would ask, and I would tell her something truthful and vague. Busy, tiring, fine. It was small talk at the edge of a cliff. I began to sew my plan into the fabric of small things so it would feel inevitable when it revealed itself. I took more control of the finances, discreetly. I called the bank under the guise of updating account security and, with a voice that belonged to a man with enough authority to be trusted, asked for copies of recent transfers to a handful of merchants. Christina had mentioned certain boutique event planners, a travel booking company, a private gym chain. The bank's fraud department was a bureaucratic maze, but routine questions about suspicious activity got us to the right desk. I flagged a few transfers and requested temporary holds on accounts where joint funds had been recently drawn. It was a surgical intervention designed to produce consequences without a scene. At work, I kept my head down. Logistics rarely rewards drama. If anything, it punishes it. The men I shared a break room with were practical. They saw things as parts and routes and deadlines. I told no one. Men in blue-collar towns do not gossip easily about marriage. Even when they do, the gossip is a ritual of pain, not a weapon. My colleagues noticed my silence mostly as a personal quirk. They asked if I was okay, and I shrugged them off with the practiced nonchalance of a man who'd learned to mask small wounds. The office where Marta worked was a different ecosystem, slick, clever, fertile ground for rumor. I couldn't walk in and fling accusations. That would fall apart under HR protocols and sworn testimony. But I could use the grit of reality to make the rumor mill self-sustaining. I started with the edges. A casual mention of a bank audit to a woman I knew from PTA who worked part-time at the agency, an offhand remark about alleged irregularities in expense accounts to a friend of Marta's that I ran into at the grocery. Humans are pattern-seeking machines. Once a seed of doubt is planted, it springs into a garden. The point wasn't ruin. Not yet, but discomfort. People who can't maintain plausible deniability are easier to corner when the stakes are raised. Marta began to notice, of course. She would hover at the edge of the kitchen and say things like, "Do you think the kids notice?" Or, "Is this really necessary?" Her voice would tighten when she said necessary, as if she wanted the word to mean mercy. I told her truthfully that the needs I was protecting were irreducible: Ross's sense of security, Amelia's childhood. That was the truth. All else was strategy. In the quiet cardboard of midnight, when the house finally surrendered to sleep, I scrolled through messages and uncovered a messy map of infidelity. Jake had a pattern of buying expensive dinners, booking hotel rooms listed under company accounts, billing late-night flights to corporate line items with descriptions vague enough to hide the truth. The numbers told a story. Transfers to a consulting firm that didn't exist, invoices from a boutique event coordinator for private engagements, receipts for gifts coded as client appreciation. Accounting is a language of euphemism. If you learn to parse it, it becomes a ledger of secrets. I printed the most damning of the records and put them in a folder labeled urgent, as if the label could make the papers scream. The psychological pressure I applied was not all legal maneuvering. There were moments I wanted to retaliate in ways that would leave only reputations bruised and no bodies harmed. I called in some favors from a friend of a friend who ran a small local blog that covered the comings and goings of the city's nightlife. I spiked the feed with pictures of Jake's social events, not outright accusations but an insinuation: which creative director is taking the city by storm and at what cost? People clicked. Comments followed. A comb through a few public profiles yielded a thread of women who had liked certain posts at certain times. I did not publish anything defamatory. Instead, I let the internet's appetite for gossip do the work. In the gossip economy, ambiguous hints can be more destructive than direct claims because doubt is relentless. The next move was legal. I met with an attorney who had a reputation for being unflinchingly pragmatic. He smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke and had a jaw like granite. He specialized in family law and had a portfolio of victories driven not by theatrics but by meticulous paper trails. He listened to my story without interruption and then asked two questions I had not considered out loud: what do you want and what are you willing to lose? I wanted custody stability for Ross and Amelia, financial restitution for money taken without consent, and a public accounting of the affair that would protect my reputation and my children's sense of truth. What I was willing to lose was my marriage, if it came to that, and any illusions that the family I had known could be repaired in its previous form. "You have the evidence," he said after a long pause. "You have to be careful about timing. File too early and she'll have time to hide assets and spin a story. Wait too long and people will assume silence is acceptance. This is where strategic patience matters." It mattered. He recommended a subpoena for bank records and the preservation of all relevant electronic communications. He wanted copies of hotel receipts, texts, and screenshots. He said we should avoid anything that could be easily dismissed as hearsay. He gave me a checklist and a timetable that read like a campaign plan. I liked the order of it. It made me feel like a man again, one with tools and a structure. At home, the kids felt the changes like weather. Ross started to come home later, debating more fiercely in the ways teenagers do when they are trying to sharpen an identity. Amelia started asking more questions about the nature of fairness and truth, the kind of philosophical probes that hinge on the fragility of trust. I answered as honestly as I could without breaking them on purpose. I told Ross that life sometimes requires hard choices and that there are grown-up negotiations that they didn't need to be part of. For Amelia, I said that adults sometimes make mistakes, but that some mistakes can't be excused. They were not satisfied with my answers. Children rarely are, but they accepted them as anchors. I hoped that the anchors would hold. Marta's behavior oscillated between defiance and pleading. She accused me once, in the living room with the afternoon sun cutting sharp angles across the floor, of orchestrating a campaign of psychological harassment. "You're turning this into a crusade," she said, voice raw. "Is this what you want?" I told her the truth. I want the things that belong to my family protected. I want honesty. I won't stand for secret bank transfers and half-truths. She turned away, and for the first time in months, I saw a shadow of fear cross her face. Fear is a tool. Fear makes liars cautious. Fear curbs the appetite for denial. At work, I started to test the water. I requested temporary holds on certain joint accounts, citing suspected unauthorized transfers. The paperwork took its slow bureaucratic time, but within a week some of the transfers were frozen, pending review. Marta's reaction was a mixture of astonishment and anger, angst at being controlled. "This is petty," she said. "You're weaponizing paperwork." "I'm protecting our children," I responded. It wasn't an answer meant to heal. It was an answer meant to justify. In those private nights, while the home breathed and the kids slept, I assembled a dossier that could make a judge listen. I ordered certified copies of bank statements, printed emails, and collated screenshots of messages that tied expenditures to dates and times. I cross-referenced maps and phone logs to track travel. It was tedious, bureaucratic work, the kind of labor that had once bored me when the army assigned me to supply runs, and yet it had a moral clarity I could accept. The work itself was a refuge. The world was messy, but the ledger was honest. Then there were the small moral inflections that came unbidden. I thought of Jake in his mansion, perfectly coiffed, speaking in the kind of low baritone that commanded bars, and I thought of the nights in the barracks when I and my unit ate canned food and slept on rough bunks and traded jokes about the absurdities of life. I thought of how differently the same instinct, the desire to be chosen, the need for validation played out across social castes. Maybe Jake had a childhood full of glamour and not enough love. It did not absolve him. People who hurt others for sport are predators no matter the cause. That thought soothed and then soured. A breakthrough came on a grey Tuesday. A bank under audit had flagged a wire transfer, 12-0, to an account listed as Creative Consulting, timed to the weekend of Marta's alleged business trip. The bank's compliance officer returned my call and, after the right disclaimers about privacy law, suggested that the transfer could be reviewed if I initiated a formal dispute. I filed the paperwork. The bank froze the funds pending inquiry. It felt satisfying in a way that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with control. The money was not about the amount, it was about the principle. Someone, a man who called himself a creative director, had been purchasing access to my wife with my family's money. That was a theft of trust in a currency I could measure. Marta's panic was quiet but sharp when she realized the accounts were restricted. "You don't understand how messy this will be," she said, voice trembling. She wasn't talking about PR. She was talking about the practical fact that money lubricates many wings of life. Businesses need capital. If Jake's projects depended on Marta's accounts, then the game they had been playing had real-world consequences for people who were not party to the deception. "Fix it," she begged, as if that were possible without confession. I couldn't fix what she had broken without an accounting. Fixing required truth. Truth required documentation and the courage to wield it. I found myself thinking less about revenge and more about restitution. If money had changed hands illicitly, it could be returned. If promises had been broken, consequences could be negotiated. I was finding in this a new moral vocabulary. Not vengeance, necessarily, but rescue. Yet there was still a personal wrinkle, one I didn't want to fully acknowledge. In the midst of all this strategizing, a part of me liked the efficiency of being on a mission again. There is a clarity in objectives and timelines, in measurable outcomes. The armor I had worn for 2 decades, the discipline, the rules fit comfortably, even if the theater had changed. It frightened me a little, this pleasure at being competent in chaos. There was a hunger in me I had mistaken for righteousness, and that could, if I were not careful, become something else entirely. By the end of the second week, the fabric of Marta's defenses showed telltale rips. There were furtive phone calls that she hushed when I entered the room. There were receipts she misplaced in drawers that I found with careful searching. There were interactions with co-workers who lingered near the kitchen island and pulled back when I passed by. Gossip does not kill, it corrodes. Slowly, methodically, that corrosion was showing. But there were setbacks too. A surveillance camera had caught a shadow of me that night at the mansion, and a local blog had been given the blurry picture. A photograph of my profile at dusk circulated on a message board with all the accusing titillation of a town square. Jake posted a rant, the kind of theatrical outrage that predators perform when their private behavior is threatened. "Vicious perpetrators," he called the vandals. People who should be ashamed. The comment thread lit up with sympathy for his victimhood. I had expected some of this. Sympathy can be a short-sighted flame, burned out by facts thereafter. I let it burn. Sympathy could be mined for its predictability. There was one moment that almost broke me. Ross came to me one night and asked with brutal teenage honesty, "Did she leave because of you? Did you do something?" He wasn't asking whether I had been faithful. He was asking in that way children ask when their worlds tremble. Who caused the collapse? I had to decide not only how to answer, but how much of the truth the children should carry. I told him the truth in measured fragments. Yes, there were problems. Yes, we were working through them. Yes, I loved them more than anything. He looked at me with an adult suspicion and a child's fear, and then, with an awkward hug that said more than consent or resolution ever could, went back to his room. The house became a layering of small wars and larger quiet. I moved with intention. I opened accounts for the children with my own funds to ensure their tuition and extracurriculars couldn't be suddenly jeopardized. I changed passwords, moved critical information into hard copies stored in a safe deposit box. I made phone calls with names that meant leveraged lawyers, accountants, a friend who had been in the news business and knew how to manage a narrative. The web of action grew and, with it, a surprising sense of momentum. The chapter of strategic patience closed not with a shout, but with the slow click of progress. The bank held funds. The attorney prepared a subpoena. Christina offered more names and a resignation letter from a woman who'd had an affair with Jake years ago and who was suddenly brave enough to corroborate. The office rumors had taken root, and people began to step back from Marta not with malice, but with the practical caution of those who must mind reputations for paychecks. And still, I slept poorly. The quiet between midnight and 3 in the morning, the hours soldiers learn to dread when missions come due, felt like a countdown. Every plan had contingencies. Every contingency had a cost. That was the calculus I had learned to live by. Assess, accept, act. On a wet Thursday morning, as rain traced lazy lines down the kitchen window, Marta came downstairs and sat at the table holding 2 cups of coffee like life preservers. Her hands shook. For the first time since the affair had been a rumor in my mind and evidence on my phone, she spoke without rehearsing. "What are you going to do?" she asked. The question was not accusatory, nor was it pleading. It was exhausted, a small animal asking an inevitable predator to choose between mercy and annihilation. I told her, plainly and without flourish, what I had already told the attorney and the bank. The transfers would be reviewed, the accounts were under scrutiny, and if anything had been taken without consent, it would be returned. I would protect the kids, I said. I would file for divorce if that was what it came to. I would not be the quiet man who let his life be erased. She looked at me, and in her eyes, for the first time there was no calculation, only the raw, exposed thing that comes when someone realizes they have stepped off a ledge. "You always knew how to wait," she said, voice cracking. I didn't see it. She stood, walked to the window, and watched rainwater run into the gutter like a slow finger tracing a wound. That night, I prepared the next phase. Evidence, I thought, had to become undeniable. If the goal was to protect the children and ensure restitution, then we needed facts that could not be massaged into plausible deniability. I printed the bank transfers, lined up the receipts next to timestamps, catalogued the hotel bookings, and cross-referenced employee directories. The dossier felt heavy in my hands, its weight a small comfort. It meant action. It meant a future where the truth could be mobilized into consequence. Strategic patience is not passive. It is active, waiting a discipline of mind and a choreography of small, inevitable moves. This chapter had been about building the scaffolding of consequence. Allies gathered, bank holds placed, rumors seeding themselves just enough to make people look twice, legal counsel ready. The operation was not yet visible to the public in a way that would humiliate or destroy. It was a slow lever moving through the world, ready to lift the heavy iron of truth when the time came. As I turned off the lamp that night, the house sighed around me. Ross snored softly in his room, teenagers' dreams light and kinetic. Amelia's lamp was still on, a tiny island in the dark. Marta's bedroom was quiet, the closet door shut like a secret. I lay awake for a long time and felt no satisfaction in the momentum I had created, only a fierce protectiveness that felt like love, like rage, and like duty mixed together. That triple-headed thing would guide my hand in the days to come. Tomorrow would call for escalation subpoenas, a formal accounting, perhaps a confrontation that could not be contained. But the rules of engagement remain the same: minimize harm to the innocent, maximize accountability for the guilty, and never let the heat of outrage outpace the coolness of strategy. The mission had shifted from private anger to public responsibility. The war plan had a new objective: expose the truth on terms that safeguarded my children and reclaimed what had been taken. Outside, the rain stopped. A breath of cold air moved across the porch. In the silence that followed, I made a small prayer, not for reconciliation, not for revenge, but for clarity. In the months of war and logistics and fatherhood and marital fidelity, clarity was the only clean thing left. I would have it one way or another. The morning light cut through the blinds with sharp precision, slicing the kitchen into bands of white and shadow. I sat at the table, the dossier spread before me like a map of enemy positions. Bank statements, hotel receipts, airline itineraries, and screenshots of messages, each a breadcrumb leading to the truth I was chasing. The coffee in my cup steamed faintly, the aroma grounding me as I reviewed each line item. Precision mattered. Every dollar, every timestamp, every location had to tell a story that couldn't be twisted or dismissed. Ross ambled in, hoodie pulled tight, earbuds dangling, backpack slung low. "Morning, Dad." He plopped down across from me, scanning the papers with curiosity and concern. "What's all this?" His voice carried that teenage blend of disbelief and suspicion that can pierce even the most fortified facade. "Homework?" I suggested with a small smile, though my eyes stayed on the numbers. He frowned. "Really?" I sighed, realizing that innocence was already slipping from him. "No, something else. Important stuff. Nothing for you to worry about. For now." Amelia appeared shortly after, bouncing into the kitchen with the energy of someone untouched by betrayal. She sniffed the coffee in the air, wrinkled her nose at the organized chaos on the table, and asked, "Can I have a pancake?" I smiled at her simplicity. This is what I was protecting. This fragile equilibrium of childhood joy, of trust not yet contaminated by adult treachery. By mid-morning, the plan moved from paper to action. First, the legal phase. I contacted my attorney and arranged for subpoenas to be issued against financial institutions holding records of Jake Morrison's transfers. This wasn't about vengeance, it was about tracing every penny, every gift, every hotel booking funded by money that wasn't rightfully his. If he'd built a house on deception, we would map its foundation. Christina's intel became a critical asset. She provided passwords to old accounts Jake hadn't bothered to secure after their divorce. I accessed them quietly, reviewing private calendars, contacts, and old emails. Every entry reinforced the pattern: a predator preying on vulnerable stability, cloaked in charm and wealth. Patterns aren't hard to read when the story repeats itself like a drumbeat. Marta's absence was predictable. She'd taken to spending long hours at the office or at client meetings, times perfectly synced with Jake's predictable routines. I trailed these routines, learning habits, identifying weak points in his armor. Every Thursday, his private gym hosted VIP training sessions, and Jake's commuting routes, though seemingly spontaneous, were predictable. A man's ego always reveals his paths. The first surveillance test was uneventful, but enlightening. I parked a quarter mile from the gym, hidden behind trees, binoculars resting on my dashboard. Jake arrived, perfectly coiffed, exuding confidence, surrounded by enablers who adored his presence. The sessions were public, but his after-work movements were private. The private driveway, the high-tech gates, the obscured entry points. It was a fortress, but no fortress is impenetrable to observation. Back home, the kids' routines provided both challenge and solace. Ross's debate topics increasingly touched on ethics and justice, almost as if his intuition knew the undercurrents around him. Amelia asked more questions about fairness, truth, and loyalty, testing my answers with the incisive curiosity only a 15-year-old could wield. I navigated carefully, offering fragments of truth without letting them bear the full weight of adult betrayal. Their innocence was the most delicate asset I had. By the end of the first week of surveillance, I had a clear pattern. Thursday nights, gym. Post-session social, departure to mansion. Friday mornings, check-ins from Marta, vague explanations. Occasional late flights under the guise of work trips. Saturday afternoons, financial transfers, hotel bookings, and dinner reservations tied to Jake's private ventures. Everything traceable, everything predictable. Then came the psychological phase. Not violence, not exposure yet, but subtle disruption. I wasn't ready for confrontation. I was ready for preparation. A dead fish, spray paint, and deflated tires were simple enough, but in this phase, the operation needed more finesse. I began nudging Marta's awareness without direct contact. Small suggestions about finances, casual mentions of unexpected audits, hints dropped to mutual friends about online security. The goal wasn't panic, it was to unbalance her narrative, make her wary of the path she had chosen. Jake, of course, was unaware. He believed himself untouchable. Arrogance is the luxury of predators, but it's also a predictable vulnerability. All it takes is a single, calculated disruption to force them into mistakes, and mistakes are the only way to gather undeniable proof. The first indirect test came via his social media. Using the patterns Christina provided, I cross-referenced posts with his known activities. A picture here, a tag's location there, times inconsistent with public claims. Nothing actionable alone, but together, a mosaic of truth was emerging. Legal research consumed the nights. Family law, fraud statutes, financial reporting requirements. The checklist from my attorney was a roadmap: preserve evidence, establish timelines, secure corroboration, and maintain plausible deniability for any actions outside of legal scrutiny. I took notes in a leather-bound notebook, my sniper's precision translating into civilian vigilance, accuracy over drama. Marta began sensing the pressure. Subtle, almost imperceptible hesitations, a twitch when she typed messages, hurried explanations about late nights and urgent projects. She walked on the edge of awareness, not knowing that every move she made was being recorded, every pattern cross-checked. By the end of the second week, I had created a triangulation of Jake's life: financial, social, and logistical. Christina continued to provide insights, occasionally joining me for late-night coffee sessions at a dimly lit diner where the smell of grilled cheese sandwiches mingled with the faint tang of espresso. She shared names of women who had previously been involved with him, corroborating patterns, validating my suspicions. One Friday night, I traced a 12-0 transfer from Marta's account to an account labeled Creative Consulting. Timing: a weekend hotel booking linked to Jake's private events. I contacted the bank under the guise of potential unauthorized transfers. Accounts were frozen. Marta's reaction was immediate, a mixture of panic, anger, and pleading. She realized finally that her actions had consequences that were no longer theoretical. Meanwhile, the home remained a delicate theater. Ross and Amelia observed without seeing, trusted without knowing, lived without the full knowledge of the chaos beneath the surface. They were my focus, the reason patience mattered. Strategic patience, calculated restraint. Every move was a chess piece. The stakes were the integrity of the family and the consequences for a man who had believed he was untouchable. In the quiet hours, I reviewed Jake's digital footprint, correlating timestamps, locations, and financial transactions. The pattern was unmistakable. It was predictable. It was vulnerable. Every empire built on deception has cracks. All that was left was to determine the proper point of exposure, the precise moment when the evidence, the legal groundwork, and the psychological pressure would converge into undeniable truth. Marta's brief confrontations in the kitchen, her hurried text messages, her small faltering lies, they were all data points now. Her narrative was unraveling faster than she anticipated, and each misstep tightened the web I had constructed. The dossier grew heavier with each passing day, a physical manifestation of control regained. Each bank record, each hotel receipt, each screenshot proof. I no longer acted out of rage alone. I was guided by method, by discipline, by the certainty that actions must be aligned with outcome. By the end of Chapter 3, the battlefield had been mapped, allies secured, contingencies calculated, and the first indirect blows delivered. The next phase loomed: confrontation, public exposure, and the reclamation of what had been stolen. The chessboard was set, the pieces in position, and the king, Jake Morrison, oblivious to the storm approaching. Strategic patience was not passive. It was the quiet hand that guides chaos toward justice. And I had patience. I had evidence. I had purpose. Thursday arrived with a sharp chill in the air, a warning that winter was creeping in earlier than expected. The streets glistened from an overnight frost, and the sunlight reflected off the icy patches like scattered shards of glass. I drove past the usual routes, noting traffic patterns, security camera placements, and the predictable arrogance of Jake Morrison. He believed his routines were invisible. He was wrong. The private gym, a modern fortress disguised as a haven for the wealthy, loomed ahead, expensive glass panels, chrome accents, and the subtle hum of climate control marked it as untouchable in the eyes of the uninformed. But visibility is vulnerability, and my eyes were trained to see what others overlooked. From a safe distance, I watched as Jake arrived, perfectly coiffed, smiling at his entourage. The women in the group laughed a little too loudly at his jokes, men nodded with forced admiration. I lingered behind a cluster of trees, my truck hidden from view. Binoculars and a notebook became extensions of my senses. Every greeting, every handshake, every glance was catalogued. This was the precision phase observation. Every empire has cracks, and tonight, I would find his. By mid-afternoon, I returned home, carefully parking on the street several blocks away. The kids were at school, Amelia had a debate tournament, and Ross had a late practice. Their schedules were predictable, controlled, safe. Marta, of course, was nowhere to be seen, likely ensconced in her office or at a client dinner. Perfect. I reviewed my dossier one last time. Hotel receipts, bank transfers, screenshot evidence, and a carefully prepared timeline of Jake's movements. Every move he made had been mapped. Every predictable pattern exploited. The final piece was a simple, non-lethal but highly humiliating intervention. A dead fish wrapped in newspaper, spray paint, and a note that would speak louder than confrontation ever could. At 8:30 p.m. I began the approach. The forest bordering his estate provided cover. My footsteps were silent, calculated, every movement deliberate. The Tesla in the driveway gleamed under the exterior lights, a monument to arrogance. The first tire went down with a controlled hiss, followed swiftly by the second, third, and fourth. The deflated tires sagged under the weight of the vehicle, a subtle but undeniable message. I left the fish on the hood, accompanied by a note in bold letters, "This smells better than your character." Spray paint marked the windshield, "Home wrecker." Nothing lethal. Nothing illegal beyond property damage, and yet the message was clear. Pride was bruised, control was shaken. Suddenly, motion sensor lights flared. Security cameras pivoted toward me. I froze for a heartbeat before ducking behind a tree, the images of my face obscured by the brim of my baseball cap. The camera captured a shadow, a figure, but nothing that could immediately identify me. I retreated to my truck, heart calm, training kicking in, patience, withdrawal, observation. At home, the phone buzzed Marta. "Where are you?" Her tone carried worry, suspicion, a touch of guilt. "Driving," I replied calmly. Insomnia. She didn't push further. The first move had been made. The psychological impact on Jake Morrison had begun. By morning, social media exploded. Photos of the vandalized Tesla circulated, with captions ranging from outrage to disbelief. Jake's ego was bruised, his arrogance challenged. The police had been called, but without clear evidence of my identity, there was little they could do. Marta arrived home early, flushed, nervous, pacing the kitchen. Her eyes darted, her fingers fidgeted, and her voice quivered as she asked, "David, did you?" "Did I what?" I replied, keeping my tone even. "I was asleep. You know how insomnia island." Her gaze faltered. Panic and guilt mingled. "Work drama," she muttered. I allowed her that lie. For now, let her question herself. Let her consider the implications. The weight of her actions was starting to settle. Detective Sarah Chen called later that afternoon, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and decades of experience. "Mr. Mitchell, we're investigating vandalism at Mr. Morrison's residence. Are you familiar with him?" I maintained composure. "Only by reputation. My wife works at the same company, but I've never met him." She questioned me briefly about my whereabouts. My answers were factual, verifiable. Alone at night, driving to clear my head. Nothing incriminating. Strategic patience. That evening, Marta returned home, visibly shaken. She avoided my eyes, made excuses about late work hours, traffic, and client emergencies. I listened silently, noting every hesitation, every faltering word. She was unraveling faster than she realized. At dinner, Ross and Amelia talked about school and friends, oblivious to the storm beneath the surface. Their normalcy was a balm, a reminder of why calculated restraint mattered. I responded to their chatter, laughed when appropriate, but my mind remained on the unfolding operation. Late that night, after the kids were asleep, I reviewed the evidence once more. Bank transfers, hotel receipts, social media activity, and email logs all converged into a singular, irrefutable narrative. Jake's pattern was exposed, Marta's complicity recorded, every piece in its proper place. The next step was confrontation, the point where evidence, planning, and opportunity intersected. I prepared carefully. Legal counsel, printed documentation, digital backups, and a clear narrative. Public exposure would need precision. Emotional reactions, timing, and presence of witnesses were crucial. One misstep could turn justice into chaos. Thursday ended with preparation, anticipation, and a quiet, cold resolve. The chessboard was nearly set. Jake Morrison had been observed, documented, and subtly disrupted. Marta was beginning to realize that the illusions she had relied upon were crumbling. The final confrontation loomed: the company holiday party, a perfect stage where pride, exposure, and truth would collide. Public observation would ensure accountability, every witness, every reaction, every detail meticulously calculated. By the end of chapter 4, the trap was ready, the pieces were in position, and I was ready to strike not with brute force, but with evidence, patience, and precision. The reckoning was imminent. The Marriott's grand ballroom gleamed under chandeliers that scattered light across polished floors and meticulously arranged tables. The air carried the faint scent of champagne, perfume, and the subtle undertone of ambition. Pinnacle Advertising's annual holiday party was in full swing. Employees and spouses mingled, the hum of networking mingling with laughter and clinking glasses. The perfect stage, and tonight, the culmination of weeks of surveillance, planning, and patience. Marta descended the grand staircase, a vision in black, the dress hugging her in ways that drew attention without intention. Her hair cascaded over her shoulders, perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, but there was a tension in her posture, a nervousness behind her poised exterior. She smiled at acquaintances, laughed politely, but I noticed the subtle glances toward a certain corner of the room. Jake Morrison, he was there, as expected. Tall, confident, radiating charisma that seemed rehearsed, yet effortless. Surrounded by admirers, he laughed easily at comments, gestures animated, hands resting on the small of backs and shoulders, claiming territory without thought. To anyone else, he was untouchable. To me, he was predictable. I nursed a bourbon at a table near the perimeter, eyes tracking every movement. Victoria, Marta's sister, was strategically positioned between us, a silent ally whose presence ensured Marta couldn't escape or intercept my observation. She nodded subtly at me when Jake laughed too loudly, a small signal confirming that the moment was near. For weeks, I had built the narrative, collected evidence, and mapped the battlefield. Now, execution required timing, precision, and nerves of steel. I stood, bourbon in hand, and made my way toward the center of the room. Whispers followed me, curious eyes, polite smiles, and subtle suspicions, but nothing more. I raised my glass, clearing my throat. The room quieted, attention flicking toward me. "May I add to the toast?" I said, voice carrying confidently. Murmurs spread, curious and cautious. Marta's face went pale. Jake's eyebrows knitted in confusion. Victoria remained poised, watching every reaction. "To partnerships," I began, my eyes scanning the room and landing on Jake. "May they be built on honesty, trust, and mutual respect. And may they last longer than my wife's gym memberships." A ripple of laughter spread across tables, some confused, some bemused. Marta stiffened, realizing the personal jab. Jake's expression darkened, a flicker of recognition dawning. "To those who honor commitments," I continued, letting the pause hang in the air, drawing tension into a palpable thread, "and to those who break them, may they face the consequences of their actions." Gasps echoed, the room shifting as people processed the undertones. Marta's hand trembled as she set down her champagne flute, eyes wide. Jake's jaw tightened. Victoria subtly positioned herself closer to Marta, a protective barrier, while I reached into my jacket pocket and retrieved the printed emails, screenshots of messages, explicit and undeniable. "You know what's really funny?" I said, unfolding the first page and holding it high enough for those nearby to see. "I found this on my wife's laptop the other day. Want to hear what it says?" Jake's face went pale. Marta froze. Security personnel began to glance in our direction. I read aloud, voice steady. Can't wait to feel you inside me again tonight at the mansion, where nothing but that smile I love so much." The room froze. Conversations halted mid-sentence. The click of cameras, whispers of shock, and the subtle gasp of employees reverberated against the chandeliers. Marta's hands flew to her face, mortified, realization crashing down like a physical weight. Jake's smile vanished, replaced by fury and confusion. Victoria stepped forward, attempting to grab the papers, but I held them out of reach. The authority of truth was in my hands. "This wasn't sent to me. It was sent to my wife from Jake here," I said, eyes locked on him, voice cutting through the room with the precision of a sniper's bullet. Jake took a step forward, trying to mask panic with bravado. "Put that away," he said, tone strained. "Friend?" I echoed, incredulous. "No, Jake, we are not friends, and you clearly don't understand the meaning of the word." Security moved closer. Marta whispered my name, a mix of terror and desperation. "David, stop." But I wasn't finished. "Here's to partnerships," I continued, lifting my glass one final time. "And here's to Jake Morrison. May he choke on his own arrogance." The bourbon flew from my hand, a precise arc that drenched his designer suit. Gasps rang out. Jake lunged, but I sidestepped, trained reflexes kicking in. He stumbled into a table, shrimp, and cocktail sauce flying, a vivid mess that mirrored his unraveling composure. Security finally intervened, restraining him, but the humiliation was complete. Half the ballroom had witnessed it, the rest would hear by morning. Marta's face, flushed with embarrassment and fear, met mine. There was anger, devastation, and, perhaps, a flicker of respect. "See you at home, honey," I said, voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." The ride home was silent. Marta stared out the window, thoughts unreadable. I drove steadily, maintaining composure, preparing for the conversation that would define the next chapter of our lives. At home, the kitchen lights cast a warm glow. Marta sank into a chair, defeated, makeup smudged, dress wrinkled. Victoria remained, watching silently, protective, judging, loyal. "That was quite a performance tonight," Victoria said, voice sharp. "Are you proud of yourself?" "Yes," I replied calmly. "I'm proud of telling the truth." Marta's eyes filled with tears. "David, I can't explain." "Explain what?" I asked softly, voice carrying the weight of 23 years of betrayal. "That you've been lying? That you've been sneaking around behind my back?" Victoria's eyes flashed with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about." I pulled out my phone, showing the screenshots, the messages, the undeniable evidence. Marta's face crumpled. "It's not what you think," she whispered. "It's exactly what I think," I replied. "You've been involved with a man who preys on families, on trust, on stability. You've forgotten who we are, what we built. I've been faithful, working 2 jobs, raising our children, loving you. He is nothing like me. But since you've forgotten, let me remind you. I didn't mean," Marta faltered. "I'll be filing for divorce tomorrow," I said, voice steady, cold. "I'm also calling my lawyer about the joint accounts. 50, 0 transferred to him over 3 months. Did you think I wouldn't notice?" Her face went white. "That was for his business. He's starting his own agency." "Starting an agency or starting a trail of broken homes?" I interrupted. "No excuses. Consequences exist for a reason." The house was silent, save for the ticking of the clock. Amelia and Ross remained asleep upstairs, unaware of the storm, the betrayal, and the reckoning unfolding below. Victoria, observing, nodded once. Justice had been served not through violence, but precision, patience, and undeniable truth. Marta slumped, her choices laid bare. The marriage that had endured 23 years now faced its final test: accountability, exposure, and the stark reality of consequences. I poured a bourbon for myself, letting the warmth seep through the cold. Tonight, the battle was over. Tomorrow, the aftermath would begin. The reckoning was complete. The predator had been humiliated, the accomplice confronted, and the foundation of truth firmly restored.